Hi guys, welcome to this video covering the painting and weathering of the Su-25. If you haven't seen the two previous videos in the series, I recommend you do so. As usual, we've got quite a lot of masking to do on this, and we've got quite a complicated scheme as well, and I'm going to show you how I did that. You may have your own ideas and different suggestions. If you do, write them down in the comments. I'm always pleased to hear input. So basically what I'm doing here is applying a bit of seam checking. Didn't really go in for any of this pre-shading type stuff because we've got a camo pattern, but in this instance we just need to check out the seams, in particular the main seam of the fuselage, do a few corrections, nothing wrong in doing that. And also we did have quite a few areas underneath the aircraft where we did quite a lot of filler and some card and all sorts and pieces. But this does look like pre-shading. Okay, I will admit, I went in for a bit of shading just to make sure that the panel lines had enough depth for them. So we're using the Mr. Surfacer primer. And also just point out with this canopy as well, I had a set of masks for both the inside and the outside, so we're able to apply the surfacer on those transparent parts. Now these are some of the resin accessories as well. Decided to prepare these prior to the paintwork as well. These are the Fab 100 kilogram free-fall dumb bombs. A little bit of work involved, to be honest, in putting these together, but they do look pretty good once they are assembled. And also we did get a rack as well. Had to modify the existing pylons that are supplied in the kit, and had some input as well on the last video suggesting that I detail up the actual canopy, and I have taken that advice on board. Now this is the main primer that I'm using. Again, Mr. Surfacer, this is 1500 grey. Why have I gone for grey instead of the black? Well, when you go use a black primer, you've got to fight that primer with whatever colour you're going to use for the final camouflage. And in this instance, we've got a very light underneath colour, so fighting against the black, it's just a lot easier to use a grey. Now check your references. If you're going to use references, I do use references, and what I did notice is that the supposed blue colour underneath seemed to be a lot lighter in the reference photographs. In some photographs it actually appeared white, so I put together a mixture of the Air Superiority blue with white, Mr. Surfacer white, created this own blend, so a bluey white sort of colour. And you'll see how this pans out. I was quite pleased actually with this particular tone rather than that, glaringly obvious blue. I'm just showing you, this is an example of a way to do masking, and you'll see later on that I didn't actually employ this, but you can use your masking tape, place it up against the surface, draw your pattern, and this is a specialist sort of tool to cut curves. Cut out the pattern and again stick it onto the model itself. But as you can see here, I actually ended up in the end using this sort of blue tack stuff, or Patafix. And to apply the camouflage colors, I actually used the scheme from the DCS video game simulator. It was the sort of best reference I could find for these patterns. Now what I did notice with the Su-25s is that there isn't a particular pattern. They all seem to be different, but I used the one from my DCS example. Now what I've done, I've freehanded on all three colours initially, starting off with the red brown, then the light green, and finally moving on to this sort of pale brown colour. But in order to create a more realistic pattern, you have to tighten up the camo. So now we're doing the exact reverse again. What I've used here is something called science putty. It's like a silly putty to basically tighten up the edges of this camouflage, and that more accurately represents what I saw in the images, especially in scale as well, in 48 scale as well. The sort of soft edge camo. You can freehand it. It does look okay, but this is my preferred method. And actually on the drop tanks as well, there's a very distinctive wavy pattern, and I was able to replicate that in using a special masking technique. If you have a look on Patreon, I'll tell you exactly how I did it. It's not a big secret by any means, but I found a little hack there if you need to do these sort of wavy patterns. Haven't got exactly as per the references, but close enough for me. The final bit of masking, or some more of the masking that I did, was to create those blue areas on the nose and on the air intakes. And of course, it's time to base paint the armament, which is a grey. I used the same grey for the interior of the landing gear doors. Did prime the resin wheels with the black primer, but using NATO black, a black grey, looks more realistic. Use the same colour as well on the ejection seat, the resin ejection seat, as opposed to the supplied plastic one. And if you see my other videos, you'll be totally familiar with this technique, using a circular template to form the masking for the wheels. There we are, not a bad result. This is the ejector rack, again, an aftermarket part that allows you to construct the armament with those 4 Fab 100 bombs. And I'm not going to show the decals. All I'll say is that I did use out of the can varnish as a gloss prior to applying the decals, or the water stickers as we're going to refer to them from now forwards. And on the weathering, using my usual mixtures of Mr. Colour, creating a very dark black-brown mix. You need quite a dark colour in order to create some contrast with the camouflage colours. And because we've got a gloss down, it's a lot easier to run the wash into the panel lines. You don't need to be exact when you're doing this. Finally, clean up. My preferred method is to use a soft piece of rag after the wash is dried for about maybe 10-15 minutes. It's sort of touch dry. You can use your rag, and what it does is it leaves the wash within the panel lines, but you can remove it, the exterior mount, the part that's washed over the surface. Use the same mixture as well, maybe a little bit more dilute for the dorsal portion of the aircraft. Did notice on my weathering that Su-25s are particularly grimy underneath, so I'll go on to that. All the armament now gets the same wash treatment, and this is what I would... Is it weathering or is it just finishing? Anyways, I use this GX100, one of my favourite flat clears. Provides a very uniform coat, gives it that characteristic military appearance. And again, that's applied to everything. Just a point to note as well, the armament is being painted individual just because it gets more and more awkward to handle the model the more you add on to it. Moving the masks at this stage, really just checking to see that everything worked out okay, which it did. You can see inside the main canopy just little bits of not overspray, but paint flakes that you can clean out using a cotton swab. And finally, we're brush painting the ejection seat using a green color, and the harness itself highlighted using that silver grey color. Finally, an application of a very dark wash, and using my favorite pen type markers to detail some of the points, and a light dry brushing just to pop that detail out. And we're using oil paints for the main weathering, which, as I mentioned, seems to be the underneath of these aircraft really do look like dirty birds. seems to be quite a lot of fluids or whatever that may be leaking out of the engines or whatever. So create some grime effects using this grey colour that's called Starship Filth by Ammo of Mig. Just one of my favourite colours really for weathering generally. And just using a slightly different technique on the drop tanks, stippling in the oil just to give it that sort of dirty appearance. The drop tanks tend to be attached to Su-25s on a regular basis, so they pick up the same weathering as the aircraft itself. I've just gone on some black as well, just to create some other tones. Did notice that this outlet here did seem to be particularly grimy. Now I'm just showing you here, this is a post-shade technique. The point to note here is using just one drop of paint to the thinner to create a very, very dilute mix. It's barely visible as you spray it. Use a light pressure, just build it up slowly, and then you'll get the effect that you want. If you go too heavy, it does look maybe a little bit overdone, but by building up very slowly, you can control the effect. I think that's what I'm really trying to say. And just a little bit of dust wash being applied to these very bulky wheels that are characteristic of the Su-25. The front landing gear is it's actually just held into place just via friction, so I was able to rotate it. And now we can finally fix the stores in place, starting with the free fall bombs and then the drop tanks. And at this point now, this is sort of my plan to complete everything underneath the aircraft, so I can flip it the other way, or the correct way up, and complete the final detailing. So I'm just adding on the final components, the sort of components that you would typically knock off during the painting stage, during the weathering stage. So there isn't too many in this case. Mainly that area on top. Fit in the ejection seat, and I added in those mirrors as was suggested by one of the commentators on the previous YouTube video. I replaced this strut that holds the canopy in place when it's open, just with a piece of fine wire, just to give it a little bit more finesse. And now we're just using the paint markers again, just to add those final little points of color, the rear ident lights, and also a bit of the crystal colors to the navigation lights. And also, this was obviously the most delicate part of this aircraft. These flight data probes are applied at the very, very end. I'll just show you this figure. This figure actually depicts Roman Filipov, Goroy Rossi, who lost his life fighting in the Syrian campaign. Okay, and finally, some finished images. Hope you enjoyed the video, and see you soon.